Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Adrian Amos with Synergy Technical, and I'm going to be talking today about changes in the Microsoft Purview UI. There's been a lot of development and a lot of changes in that space since we first talked about this. It's been almost 3 years ago. It was in June of 2022. And I never actually thought that a webinar on compliance technologies would get quite the traction that it has. But amazingly, close to 12,000 people have watched that video in some component or portion since it was published. And so apparently we're a little bit more excited to talk about compliance than we really think we are. And I like to say that I view compliance as being operationalized security, or kind of security with a purpose, right? So there is a lot to be discussed in it. There's a lot of actual exciting things that we can do in compliance that really can actually help drive our security forward, really help drive improvements in our security posture through compliance. So we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about things that have changed, things that have already been there but haven't really gotten the attention and love that they've deserved in the past, and hopefully we'll see some cool new stuff along the way. So the reason why we want to talk about this right now is not just because it's been 2.5 or almost 3 years, but because there has been a whole new UI released. And that UI, when it was dropped in the middle of last year, was not my favorite thing. It took me a little bit of time to adjust to it, but Microsoft did announce in late summer that the legacy UI was going to be retired in December. And so I kind of wanted to start talking about it then, but we kind of missed some things and other things kind of took priority. So my apologies. I really wanted to bring you this content some time ago. But if you're looking at the compliance portal now, you'll notice that if you're in the legacy compliance URLs, you're going to see this interstitial that says it's gone, it's done, it's been fully retired. And you have about 15 seconds before it'll take you into the new Purview portal. So let's talk about what's changed in the UI, right? So the legacy UI, and I actually had to go back to the old deck from the previous webinar to get a view of it because you can't get there anymore. What I liked about it was that it actually aligned things very conveniently, very similarly to the Defender XDR portal, right? So you'd have your list of all of your tools, all your solutions on the left-hand blade. You'd have your home screen and your docked things up there, and then you could see all the different solutions and components that you owned, right? So it was all just neatly aligned over here. And this was great for me because it aligned to the way that I do things. I actually demo all of these components, and so being able to see them all in one convenient spot was very easy for me. However, a lot of compliance people don't really work like that. They don't really need to see all of the tools available in the entire stack in order to do their job. A lot of times we may have them working in 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 different areas at a time. And what we do now with the new UI, which is a little prettier, a little friendlier, is we're surfacing up some key insights. We're showing links to where those solutions are, but we're really only docking a few critical elements. A home screen, a solutions list that we can click on to pop out, and you can see right there. But underneath that, we're just going to have some basic elements, and then we're only going to surface the top 4 or 5 solutions that are compliance officers or data officers or whatever the people may be who are in this environment are going to be working with. They don't need to see all of those things. And in fact, my environment, the way that I've got it configured, is actually intentionally broken for my demo purposes to make sure that I can see all of the solutions and operate on all the solutions. The reality is you're going to assign different users different rights, and they're just not going to need all of that content. So we have all of our key elements here. They're in little icon spaces now. You can't expand the left-hand blade anymore to see the names of all the things. You can pop out the list of solutions to see all of the available things that are there, and then also the list of related portals near the bottom. Now you might notice, and we talked about Microsoft Purview a couple of years ago, while that is actually under a purview.microsoft.com URL, it is its own separate portal. So we are not going to dive into that guy today. It's been fully carved out and moved over into its own space. But the last thing I'll point out in the home screen is that we now also have a search bar. And that search bar works very much like it does in most of the other Microsoft portals. You start searching for, a subset of the characters that you want for the thing you're looking to find, and you'll find it along not just with the solutions, but the controls inside the solutions, and then also external links to additional learnings. And speaking of additional learnings, we now actually also have a knowledge center that's locked into the core top left blade. So that knowledge center is going to contain documents that are aligned to specific solutions inside the Purview stack. It's also going to be videos. It's also going to be blogs. So there's going to be a lot of links to YouTube, to Microsoft Learn, to areas where you can learn more about what are the things that we're trying to do. And don't skip this stuff, right? This is actually really important stuff. Like, there's a lot of what we're going to be talking about and digging into when we look at these compliance solutions. There's going to be a lot of pre-reading that's going to be necessary before we start rolling these things out. I saw a great blog post just a week or so ago that talked about what the big challenge that you get into with Purview products and Purview deployments is not that the technology itself is difficult to roll out. It's that imposing compliance solutions is a disruptive event, right? I'm wearing my Be Disruptive t-shirt underneath my my polo here, but we do want to manage and minimize our disruptions for our users. We want to make sure that they are productive as much as possible. And while we have demonstrated for years that we can be secure and productive at the same time, a lot of times when we start layering in the data control stuff underneath, we can actually start introducing some disruption. So we want to be very cautious with that and make sure that we truly understand the things that we're trying to do. So moving on from that, we also have a unified settings page. And this is a little bit of a change too. This, again, more closely resembles the way that the Defender XDR portal works. But from a compliance perspective, the reason why I believe we have this unified settings view is that as administrators controlling these solutions, not necessarily the operational folks who are responsible for it. So we're not compliance officers, we're not data officers. We are delivering the solutions that they will use to do the work that they need to do. So for us to deliver those solutions, we need to define the settings, we need to set the parameters for those compliance solutions so that they can get in and be successful delivering the compliance requirements that they need in their tool sets. So we can define the settings. We have some new things that we'll cover too in regard to specific solutions as we get into that. But the other thing that we're going to notice as we start digging through the actual solutions docked on the left-hand blade is that most of them are now going to start with an overview that's going to list the things that we should be focused on to get the most bang for our buck, right? As we start rolling these products out, these are the things you're going to need to read. These are the things you're going to need to implement. These are the things you're going to need to detect. And this is kind of how it's going to give you a step-by-step process. So we'll dig into all that. But the first thing I want to do, and this is the single most replayed component of the old webinar, is a revisit to Compliance Manager. So Compliance Manager kind of takes us all the way back to our roots of Microsoft's journey into tracking compliance and governance in the cloud at all. This whole thing began arguably with Compliance Manager in the Service Trust Portal back in 2018, I think it was, in response to GDPR. Compliance Manager has grown a lot, and I'm not going to completely re-drain the lake here on Compliance Manager, but it is worth discussing again, right? So when we start talking about what Compliance Manager is, it is a solution to allow you to assess the state of controls in your environment against specific regulations that you may have, may be required to meet for your organization. Okay, so it's going to give you a combination of people, processes, and technologies that are able to be assessed, and in many cases, we're going to leverage Secure Score to handle automated testing of those solutions. But everything is going to have a score value that if you get to full compliance with this control, you'll get this score. And that's going to allow us to track an overall score. Now, you'll notice here up in the top right-hand corner that there is another check mark for a new overview. So this is another area where things are changing. And you'll notice that if you do click on that button and you go to that, you do now start to see that getting started recommendations list. We also see our compliance score and our history reports, but gone is, if you were to scroll down from the original, the top part of the first page would be a list of how all the solutions in your Microsoft stack are contributing to your compliance score. That's not there anymore. That data is still available over here in the blades on the left. But let's talk about how we get to that score. So now we actually have this really nice list here of the solutions that comprise all the controls and actions that we need to govern. What I like here is that I, as a compliance officer, and I'm changing my hats all the time in this, so I, as a compliance officer, may not be responsible for data loss prevention. I may not be responsible for Exchange Online. But I am responsible for driving the best compliance settings that I need to do for GDPR, for PCI DSS, for HIPAA, for whatever, right? So I know that we have Exchange Online, and it looks like there are 7 remaining actions that need to be taken in Exchange Online based on the compliance regulations that I have set up as assessments in my environment. So if I click on any one of these numbers under remaining actions, it's going to take me to the list of the specific actions that are required for total compliance in that solution, and then I can click on the list for select all here and assign these to a person who is responsible for those controls. So it gives me a little bit easier one-stop shopping to make sure that the right person has the right tools or has the right actions to take, and they know what they're supposed to be doing. So what changed, though, in Compliance Manager other than just a pretty new UI at the beginning? Well, not long after we did that webinar, the pricing dropped 5-fold. And this is actually really, I didn't even notice this until another engineer on our team called me up and said, why are you quoting old pricing for Compliance Manager? I did not realize this had happened, and my humblest apologies to those who've heard me talk about the old pricing in the last couple of years. But now it's $500 a month per assessment or per template. Okay, and the way that we license these templates, it has also changed too. It used to be if you needed to do something like CMMC, you would light up the level 2 template, and then if you needed to do the level 1 template, that would be a different cost. But now you can see right here, I actually have 4 premium assessments consuming only 3 licenses, and that is because now each family, each compliance family or regulatory family, it counts as one template even if we have 5 things open underneath it. And CMMC is a great example because it has all the original levels 1 through 5 in there, but it also now has the version 2.0 versions 1 and 2. CIS benchmarks, similarly, all the different families are there. So I don't have to consume multiple licenses to have multiple versions of an assessment. And what that allows me to then further do is I can actually carve off different people who would be responsible for meeting the controls of the higher level assessment and make sure that they see the controls that they're responsible for. And I can do some really neat granular distribution of tasks. It's pretty fun. So we've talked about scoring, and this actually, I had this in my deck from 2.5 years ago. I did not present it then. It's worth mentioning. It comes up a lot. How does Microsoft calculate this score? Because you'll notice there's always some value between 1 and 27 points. It's always going to be a combination of whether or not it's a mandatory or discretionary control, aligned to whether or not it's preventative, detective, or corrective. If you have something that is mandatory and it is preventative, it's going to keep the bad guys from getting in. It's going to block some potential risk vector. That's going to be a 27-point score, right? So we want to focus on those 27s as much as we can. We can deprioritize the 1s and the 3s a little bit, right? We want to focus on the 27s and the 9s, and then we'll turn our attention to the lower ones. This information, by the way, where relevant, I have links on the screen, so these might be useful links to hold on to, but we'll try to make sure also when this goes out on YouTube that these links are also available in the recording there too. So that's how your score is calculated. It is actually programmatic. It is not random in the same way that secure score may have weighted values for different things that are not quite so deterministic. So Compliance Manager, because it is also gone through some changes, has also now gotten some new user settings. And this is actually really exciting. So this one also forces me to go way back to the original days of Compliance Manager, where by design, everybody in your organization, even guest accounts, had access to your Compliance Manager. And the thought was everybody should be able to see how we're doing from a compliance perspective. You could tighten it down and you could assign things to specific people to be able to see more or to be able to make changes, but by design everybody could see it. Now we can actually set really granular controls about who's allowed to be a reader, who's allowed to be a contributor, and who's allowed to be an assessor, not just of the assessments that we've lit up, but actually of the definitions of the regulations themselves as we are pre-assessment. So we're not even lighting this assessment up. We want somebody to go over in this time and change what is the content of a California Privacy Act, right? Because for whatever reason, we need a slightly tweaked version of that. You can actually assign somebody to be able to make changes to the regulation so that when the assessment is lit up, somebody else can then contribute compliance actions. There's a lot of granularity to that, and it's a welcome improvement. And I just caution you, if you're used to the old system where everybody had access, that is very much gone. All right, so we've talked a little bit about those assessments. Let's talk about the regulations and how we light those assessments up. It used to be, and again, going back to 2018, right, this was all built around GDPR. GDPR used to be an included template, and that included templates list has slowly whittled down to the point where it is nothing but the data protection baseline. But you should not assume that that is a bad thing, right? Because it turns out this data protection baseline is actually kind of a best of the best of GDPR, FedRAMP, NIST, ISO, and actually Microsoft's non-regulatory zero trust security requirements, right? So if you can drive toward 100% of the data protection baseline, your adoption of any of the others will be very simple. This is actually a really great starting point. Don't ignore it in your environment. This should all be viewed as best practices for data management in your cloud. So it's a great place to start, and absolutely, go through this, and it's free, right? You don't have to pay for this. If you are a Microsoft Cloud customer with a Purview portal to access, purview.microsoft.com, you will be able to use the data protection baseline and see what data protections you have on your content. So, all right, so we take those things and we light them up as assessments, right? We're just going to click on a regulatory thing, say create assessment, and then we're going to have this list. Now, I mentioned that I'm consuming 3 licenses, and now I have 5 assessments because, again, that data protection baseline is included. And this is not really a fundamental change other than just to point out, again, that we do have those premium licenses that are here consuming under free regulation because I'm an E5 customer, but we can light up additional licenses. Again, $500 a month, $6,000 a year, 5-fold reduction in price, super cool. But you're going to be able to see all the things you have. Now, I did cover all of this in extensive detail before, so I just want to really quickly breeze through this. When we dig into what those assessments include, you can get a very high-level view of your controls, right? So this is going to be a view of your controls. You can also see your progress along the entire assessment. You can see your improvement actions. You can see Microsoft's improvement actions. It's worth noting that Microsoft is not always at 100% on their own things, but this is where you go to get audit data for how Microsoft is meeting certain compliance requirements. When we dig into any one of these areas and see, okay, here we go, I've got the most work to do in my access controls and my systems and communication protection, right? I can see I'm doing pretty well in media protection. I can prioritize my controls based on this really rather simplified view. But when I get into the actual improvement actions, this has also changed a little bit as well. So we've always had the ability to assign things to a specific user, track the testing, track the implementation status, but it used to be that you just kind of had details and the ability to upload a file. Well, now we can actually see all of our evidence inline and actually also include links to external websites. And then the related controls thing, this has been there forever. If you complete an action that has an impact on an additional control and even in a different assessment, you will get the credit for meeting that control as well, as implemented in this action. So you don't have to go through and upload this documentation into every single matching action across all of your assessments. You will get credit across them for doing it one time. So beautiful. Whew. Okay, so jumping back out though from the action to the actual progress of the assessment, you can always export your assessments by actions, by reports. You can actually download your evidence in bulk, and what it'll do is it'll create zip files aligned to each action. So my 2 files that are there, it's going to actually download a copy of the file, and it'll download a link file to go pull that external link evidence. So a lot of stuff there, right? We've really got some great improvements. This is where you're going to take this content and ship it off to your auditors, right? So you can download it as a report. You can download it as actions. The report is a kind of high-level executive report that just kind of shows how you're doing. It gives you pretty bars and graphs. It's not really going to meet your auditor's requirements, so you're definitely going to want to export your actions for that and make sure that you get the right folks, the right people, right content. So Going back to our regulations, you may have also noticed this concept of subservice compliance readiness. And this is a new area, right? These are included in Compliance Manager. You don't pay for them specifically, but they're designed to allow you to look at what would the compliance status be if I were to deploy workloads in Azure. So you'll note in the list here, they all say specifically they apply to Azure, not to the M365. They're not universal. They don't apply to third-party solutions like Zoom and Salesforce. They are specifically looking at Azure configurations. And they do not actually perform the same way that our regular assessments do. So we don't get our bar graphs. We don't see all that pretty stuff. What we see is a list of the controls and actions that we are responsible for, that Microsoft is responsible for. We see documentation here. If it's a Microsoft thing, it just tells you what they've done. If it's a U thing, it tells you which changes in Azure to make. So that's new. It is included. It doesn't show up in my list of assessments because, again, it's tracked differently, and it's really just looking at the configuration of Azure itself. And it should not be assumed to be a replacement for Defender for Cloud and its data regulatory controls. That's a very different thing, and I feel like that's something we need to save for a totally different conversation later. Oh my gosh, we're 20 minutes in, and we have just finished talking about Compliance Manager. There's so much here. All right, so switching gears, talking about information protection, sensitivity labels. This is something that has become a tremendous passion project for me. This is something that we've been supporting at Synergy for a decade or more at this point. It's 2025. It's been more than a decade. It's gotten to the point now where I've become so passionate that I'm starting to write really excessively long blog posts about it that may or may not eventually turn into a book. Who knows? But there's a lot to be understood here. And the reason why I'm so passionate about it is because now in this era of generative AI, there it was, you knew it was going to come out at some point, we have to be able to exercise controls over our data, not just relying on folder structures, but security that is embedded in the data itself, that defines the permissions, that defines encryptions, that can travel with the data wherever it goes, so that even if we accidentally send corporate HR documents through email to an external party, we can make sure that those people don't have access to view that content, right? It's still encrypted when it travels, and then the person trying to gain access to it is going to have to be able to satisfy our authentication requirements through our Microsoft Intra to gain access to that content, even if they have it fully offline. If they can't access and prove that they are somebody who is supposed to have access to it, they will not get access. So when we start looking at the challenges that generative AI presents, we don't want people seeing content that they shouldn't have access to see. And when we start looking at things like the semantic index that goes through and looks at all of your data and says, well, the executive compensation packages are sitting here in an Excel file, so I'm just going to include that content. We want to make sure that those are protected, not just because they're in some particular SharePoint library, but because inherent protections on the file itself make it unavailable to be used by other people. So I've got a couple of blogs, long form blogs sitting out here. They're long. There's going to be a lot more getting added to it. We also did a webinar last year. Terry Johnson sat down and went through the ins and outs of sensitivity labels. Some things have changed in sensitivity labels, and I take a slightly different approach when I configure them. So it's worth taking a look and going through and look at Terry's content and then reading these. They're lengthy, but hopefully they're more valuable than I'll have time to get into. So extremely high level, right? Sensitivity labels are an easy button. They are repeatable security settings that you apply to meetings, to Teams channels, to intra groups, to files, to SharePoint sites, to loop components now that allow us to say, this is the encryption that is required for this type of content. This is the permission set for who should gain access to it. This is the set of rights that those people should hold on this content, and I can apply it easily through the document save button now to any kind of content that I want to. It's super repeatable. It's super duper scalable, and in many cases, it may actually be a requirement for your compliance solutions, but it is absolutely a foundational requirement to make sure that generative AI is used in a way that you want it used in your environment and people gain access to the content that you want them to see. So Oh yeah, also watermarking, headers, all that kind of fun stuff. Basically, if you have it in a legacy file policy written out, we can produce it in a sensitivity label. So we take all these labels, all these easy buttons, we bundle them up in label policies, and we publish the labels that we want to the people that we want. So not everybody in the organization has to have all of the labels at all the time. We can also define what is the default behavior for these users in these contexts, right? So if you're in IT, you're going to have all the default labels of these three, but you're also going to have mandatory labeling requirements. Your meetings are going to be marked as internal, right? Your emails are going to be marked as internal. Maybe if you're in operations, you get a slightly different behavior. Maybe if you're an executive, you get a very much more restrictive behavior. But we define the labeling experience for our users through these policies. And I really want to hammer on that because that's going to become really important as we start digging through the way the other controls work later. And oh my gosh, I'm going to absolutely run out of time. Whew. So the user experience for sensitivity labeling has gone through a lot of iterative changes. And I mentioned that you now have it built right into the actual save dialog. When you go to create a new document and you hit save, you're going to give it a name, you're going to give it a location, and you're going to give it a label, right? And if you don't choose a label, we can assign a default label for you. So we can actually make it so the user doesn't even have to interact with this. In email, it's going to be a matter of choosing to click over here on this side. And in both cases, you're going to be able to see these lock icons indicate that these labels carry encryption. And you cannot do permissions without encryption. And I've said that over and over again on webinars in the past, and I'll say it again, you cannot do permissions without encryption. And that's going to be important too when we start looking at reports. So the last thing I'll say in this space too is that we also now have this concept of on-demand classification. This is a pay-per-use feature, and what it allows you to do is look back at all of your legacy data. So we've had the data scanners, and we've had the apply policies to content that's out there, and we have rules that when users open legacy content, automatically it forces them to choose a label now before they can save it. But now you're looking back at, I've got 10 years of legacy HR data. I want to make sure that that data can't pose a risk, right? Because now I've got this semantic index and it's going out and it's finding all this data. Well, if there's no encryption on it, if there's no protections on it, semantic index is going to consume it and regurgitate it back to people with no controls. On-demand classification is the stopgap to make sure that data at rest, cold data, can be protected, can be detected and protected with sensitivity labels per our organizational requirement. Again, it is a pay-per-use. You do have to create scans that go back out. They'll tell you what is out there, what's been detected, and then you can decide what to do with it. So the last thing I want to point out is that we used to have this beautiful classifications page that had all sorts of different buttons and gigaws and controls. That has been replaced now with a reports page that's scrollable, but it shows you sensitivity label usage, sensitive information type detections, trainable classifier detections, but it no longer incorporates retention. And that used to be a critical part of this view, which makes a great segue into talking about records and data lifecycle management. So I had not been passionate about this area until fairly recently. We've had the ability to define retention policies and retention labels for a long time, and I haven't really seen a lot of interest or adoption in them, but because we are talking about compliance, a lot of compliance regulations require that we have data retention capabilities. Not just hold on to everything forever, but also corporate policies that say, okay, but not really forever. We're like, we really got to get rid of stuff after 18 months. And it's very difficult to get users to buy in on that without some sort of control. So we have controls, right? And I'm going to start very simply, and I'm going to add complexity as we go, because this is not quite the same as sensitivity. In sensitivity, we define our labels, we publish our policies. With retention, we can define labels, but we actually want to start with retention policies. And these are going to be workload-specific policies, right? We're going to say in Teams, we only keep content for 18 months. In SharePoint and OneDrive, we only keep content for 5 years. In this one particular SharePoint and OneDrive library, maybe we have a different policy that says 10 years. But we're getting very wide, and then we're going to get very granular, right? So at a high level, we keep things in Teams, chats, and channels for 4 years. No preservation locks. There's no holds. We're not talking about litigation holds. We're not talking about e-discovery. We're not talking about any of those things. We're saying we hold on to this content for 4 years, and then we delete it, okay? Very simple. Where we want to start defining labels, though, and file plan content is when we need to manage exceptions to that. So this is very different, right? With sensitivity labels, we want to define our security and apply it to everything. With retention, we want to define everything and then manage our exceptions. So we're going to start wide and narrow in. Now, when we start building out retention labels, we have two different places we can actually do it. So one is in data lifecycle management, and you'll go to retention labels and you'll see a little interstitial right here that says, hey, you can do this here, but if you do it in records management under file plan, you'll actually get more features and controls. I will caution you, if you don't need those additional features and controls right now, you're totally fine to start creating your labels in data lifecycle management. The only thing you can't do once you've created a label is change the disposition at the end. You can't say retain for 7 years and then do something magical with it and then change it later to retain for 7 years and then move it to secret archive layer, right? You can't change what happens at the end, but you can change the duration, you can extend it, you can do all sorts of stuff. You can even go back in later after these labels have been created, because you can see I defined some of these years ago, and you can add additional elements to it that align it to your file plan. And those file plan information things can include a reference ID. So if you need to be able to track all the content in your environment that has this particular reference ID, whether or not it's a regulatory control or is actually marked as a legal record, there's dicey stuff you can do here. And then you can also assign it what kind of data it is. And all of this becomes metadata that travels with the file. You can even actually, it's off the edge of the screen here, but under provision, there's an element that allows you to track a specific regulatory control. So if this is something that relates to Sarbanes-Oxley, you can actually put a link in the definition of the label so that when users go to the metadata to see, oh, this is a regulatory control, oh, it pertains to Sarbox, they can actually click on it and go to get the legal language of that from an external website. So all of that can be controlled and managed as part of the metadata of the content itself by virtue of having been labeled. And then again, we have multiple different ways that we can define the retention period, right? So we have default items of 5, 7, 10 years, and then custom, but we can also decide what triggers this retention. Is it the creation? Is it modification? Is it when the content was labeled? We can actually also create custom events too and associate them with labels so we can track and drive this thing based on pretty much anything we want to do. All right. So just like our label or retention or sensitivity label policies, we actually now need to do something with these, right? We need to define some sort of a policy that triggers these actions. And you'll notice as you look at this that I have 3 that are set up as auto apply and 2 that are set up as publish. These auto apply, these do not present anything to a user ever. They will never be able to see the labels that are associated with this policy, right? These are simply service backend solutions. In this case, I've got 2 that are running by trainable classifiers. So they're using document detection to say, oh, this looks like legal document. Oh, this looks like an HR record. And then defining where we're applying that and applying these retention labels, right? Or file plan labels, because at this point now they're more complicated. I also have one that detects based on keywords in a file. And I also have a couple that are set to publish. Now, these are the ones that users will actually be able to interact with. But it's not likely that they will. So when we start creating these file plan labels and retention labels, it's really going to be incumbent upon us as data administrators to use the auto apply features, because this is not something that users will find on their own. I had to go looking for where this is in a SharePoint repository to find the file properties to come into it to set this. But once I did, I was able to find all of the labels that are set to publish. So these users can now see this. But I'm actually in those policies setting granular controls over which workloads see which labels. So while my user can see them in SharePoint, in email, they only have access to the HR records. And it's also worth pointing out that not only did I have to go through 3 separate sublabels to get to the ability to add that label, but it also shows up in line with all of the built-in labels that are in Outlook. And if you go to the actual retention policies panel in Outlook itself, you do not see the published label coming from the administrator. So again, this is something that we've struggled to get users on board with using sensitivity labels. They've complained that it's been very difficult. Microsoft has made huge leaps to make that so much easier. We're going to be struggling if we are expecting users to label data unless those users have been specifically trained on how to do this. So again, I think you're going to have a lot more success driving auto-apply labels and detecting content using your classifiers, using your keyword detections, than you're going to get asking users to manually interact with content. All right. And then if we're trying to figure out why a specific user, SharePoint site, group, whatever, is or isn't getting the behaviors that we expect, we can actually search for them and see what labels and what labeling policies are going to apply to them, where those things are going to have labels for them, and what their expected outcomes are going to be. Now, all of that was simply defining the security of the data and the retention of the data. Now we need to define the posture of the data overall from a security perspective. And this is where we're going to start looking at two new areas. So just like we've looked at a lot of things that kind of have two separate sets of controls, data security posture management is going to have two blades in the Purview portal. And I'm going to spend a lot of time in one, I'm going to spend very little time in the other, because one is really just reports. The other one is where you're going to do all the meat and the good work here. So we have DSPM for AI. So this one is the one that has a lot of content and controls in it, but it has the shorter name. So data security posture management for AI. This is really where we're going to start looking at what is the risk that generative AI brings to my data. Or I can look at the other way around. What data do I own that presents risk for my organization that may slip out the door through the use of generative AI? So for that, we're going to need to go through our getting started list. We're going to need to onboard devices into Microsoft Purview. But then you're also going to notice here that there is a Microsoft Purview browser extension. And this is currently listed in the requirements. I have a feeling this might change. A big part of what Microsoft has been driving toward in the last year or so with the Global Secure Access product is eliminating the requirement to do things on managed browsers or to establish some sort of administrative control of the browser. The challenge you get into with that is that you're really trying to regulate where the user is going and their access with their account. You're really not going to be able to control every single browser that's on the market. Right? I can download a Tor browser and do bad things on that, and Microsoft's Purview thing won't be able to track that. So really what we need to do is we need to look toward a future where we're not saying Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge. We need to look at where are they going? What credentials are they bringing? What data are they bringing? And we need to align that to the Microsoft Secure Service Edge solution. And I think that's where we're going to see it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I saw a note in the admin center or message center saying that this is actually coming. So more to come on that later. But right now, we have a pretty lengthy list of things that we need to do. We're going to have to turn on audit, enable the extensions, onboard the devices, extend the insights for data discovery. But once we do that, we actually do have a lot more controls in here than we do in here. So in data security posture management, we really just get recommendations and reports. And the reports are pretty cool, right? So we're actually going to see where is my data unprotected. And you're going to see that we have a different number of unprotected assets versus a number of unlabeled assets because not all of my labels carry encryption, right? Remember, we can't do permissions without encryption. So I'm going to have a different level of controls and a different level of reporting based on what is unprotected in these spaces, what are the labels that are on these content, but that aren't also encrypting or protecting the content. This is a really nice view. It's honestly probably the only thing that actually makes me come to the data security and posture management native panel. Otherwise, everything I'm doing is in DSPM for AI. So we have our recommendations list. This is actually kind of all this really is recommendations and reports and policies, but you're really not defining most of these things in here. The recommendations list in this is your actual operational bread and butter. You're going to come through here, you're going to get a list of the things that you need to do. It's going to pop out a list of what are the actions that you need to take. And in many cases, you can actually click create the policy directly from this view. And that's actually like one-stop shopping. If you start to create the policy and you realize it's not complex enough for you, it'll give you the ability to go in and customize it, tweak it to your needs, hit go. In a lot of cases, this is truly like 1 or 2 clicks to create your policies. They already know what the expected triggers are. They already know what the expected behaviors are and what you probably want to control. So it's really easy to get started with these. And then if it's something that needs to be done in other workloads, you can mark it as complete because it's not really giving you controls into other workloads. Our list of policies, just like with some of the other stuff in here, you're not really doing this here, right? These are the list of the policies that are impacting our DSPM for AI, but they're created in other solutions. So if I've created DLP policies, if I've created insider risk management policies, and they are impactful here, I will see that list of policies here. Our Activity Explorer, because of the policy that we created in the simple quick setup, and actually we're going to go back to it real quick here, this secure interactions with in Microsoft Copilot experiences as a preview one is going to give you the ability to track and capture your interactions for your users. So you'll see what they are doing inside of Copilot, and this is the actual specific outcome of that. I had a user, I was trying to create an email for this demo and wanted to just get a quick draft email. You saw it earlier. We expect problems with the product launch, and I had Copilot come back and generate the email. All of that is captured in here too. So I have the specific inputs, the specific outputs. I can see exactly what was tracked here. This may or may not be something that you want to turn on. We've spent time in the past covering Microsoft documentation that says users are responsible for understanding what they put in. This does now surface that information to administrators, potentially, if you turn this policy on. So the other thing that I really think is really powerful in here too is that we also have in our data assessments, which is a preview component of the blade here, we can look at oversharing assessments. And this is another critical element when organizations start transitioning into supporting generative AI. You want to control the way that users are sharing data. We got really comfortable with sending a link that anybody in the organization could access. We really had to pull back on that, both internally at Synergy and also we're advising customers. You don't want to just do organization-wide links. You don't want everything available to everybody all the time. You want to be very specific and granular. I'm sharing this with Susan. Susan gets the link, not org-wide link for everybody to look at. So this is going to give you that visibility to see what's being shared. Is it protected with sensitive information or sensitivity labels? And what labels are there? Who's getting access to it? Who's inside your organization? And who is it being shared with outside your organization? This is a report that used to be surfaced into Defender for Cloud Apps. I've talked in the past about the fact that that is no longer there. The Files tab in Defender for Cloud Apps is gone, and it no longer shows you that oversharing report. That is very much a Purview function, and this is where it has landed. All right. Whew. Suddenly, somehow, we have not yet talked about data loss prevention. So here we go, right? All of that was defining the posture management for the security and the risk of the data. Now we got to make sure it doesn't leak out the door. So DLP is a shockingly broad term in the Microsoft Cloud, covering just about everything we've talked about so far, and then layering in a whole bunch of capabilities from Intune, from Intra, from the Defender stack, from just about everything that we could possibly do. So keeping this conversation focused principally in Purview, there's still a whole lot that's here, right? So we're seeing the activities that are happening in Exchange, we're seeing the activities that are happening on devices, we're seeing labeling policies, and now we actually also see these adaptive control, adaptive protection controls that are also going to pull in insider risk management and layer that into conditional access policy. I mean, it's huge. DLP is huge. So if anybody ever says, does Microsoft do DLP? They do the DLP and then some. So we're going to have a whole lot of policies that we can define, and they're going to give you some extremely granular controls and actions. And what I wanted to point out with this slide is that not only do we have our list of the policies that are here, and I forgot to mention this under sensitivity labels earlier, they are actually listed in an order that matters. And so are the policies. The policies apply in the order that we want them to occur. So if something were to potentially have two potential outcomes from the same actions, we want to rank and prioritize which one takes precedence. So here we can define precedence as well for our DLP policies. We can actually do it very granular. A lot of these are actually automatically created out of the other engines that we've already seen. So the recommendations list that showed, things that you can do quickly, the 1 and 2 click policies. We're creating them there. They're showing up here. You can see directly this is DSPM for AI. This was generated in another engine and kicked over here. So we have the prioritization capability. We can actually just come in here and click a number if we want to. We can define the different statuses for these things. This is enabled. These are in simulation. But when we start getting in and defining these, this is that view that we've had since 2013 in the old Azure ASM portals of defining what's the high level thing that we want to start with, right? Medical content, getting into a specific regulation, or do we want to do enhanced things that are the fairly new thing, custom stuff where we want to go in and build it all by hand, and then where do we want to apply this? So, our DLP policies can apply to any of these places, and it actually also can include Fabric and BI workspaces. There's on-premises repositories, devices, teams, channels. We can do all of these together except for Fabric and Power BI. If you do a Fabric one, you're doing a custom policy that is completely its own separate thing. Then we can apply these to groups, or we can apply them to groups through exclusions, right? So it's everybody, or it's everybody but these people. It's everybody but this group, right? So we can set this up as inclusive or exclusive as we want to, and then we define what our rules are. Now, if we chose a pre-canned solution, like we're trying to meet HIPAA, then we're going to come in and it's going to predetermine what are the kinds of content that we're going to detect, what are the things that we're going to do, what are the actions, and we can just turn it on, or we can also come in, hit the pencil button, and edit this guy. If we decide to edit this guy, this is a rabbit hole. And let me tell you, you can go deep on these things. When we start creating these rules, I had to hit quick summary to be able to get even just a fraction of the list of what this policy will support. We have our conditions, our user notifications, our actions, our administrative whatevers. We have all kinds of stuff built in here. And we can build in sensitive information types. We can build in actually detections of existing sensitivity labels. So you can actually set a DLP policy that says if content has been labeled as internal amber, then also apply this policy to it. You can also then trigger retention labels based on, and you can do all kinds of stuff, right? In this case, though, we've got our simple quick summary. We want to restrict access to this content or encrypt it in Microsoft 365 locations. So right there, simple, right? If it's HIPAA, we need to have it encrypted. We need to have it restricted. But we can also get extremely granular when we start talking about endpoint DLP. This conversation comes up all the time. How do I make sure that users don't put content onto a USB drive and walk it out the door? It's right there in the rules editor for our DLP rule builder. We can define not just that they can or can't copy it to a USB drive, but can they copy it to a USB drive if they're inside the corporate network, right? So under conditional access controls, we've had the ability to define networks that we trust and don't trust. We can set all that information up and apply that here. We can also even apply to, is it coming in through a VPN? We can define specific groups of USB devices. And there's a whole separate control for building out that list, but we can get really granular. How many printers do we want to allow to communicate with? Bluetooth apps, all this kind of stuff, right? All of this we can get really, really deep on. But that also introduces some challenges, and we need to be able to have a way to run some diagnostics, right? Because we want to make sure that the right user gets the right set of controls and is able to work the way that we expect. So conveniently, there is a diagnostics button. I've talked in the past about the Intune diagnostics button. If you're not using the diagnostics buttons that are built into these workloads, you're leaving money on the table. They're actually really cool, and they just keep getting more and more powerful. I as a long-term admin would always scoff at using the diagnostics because I can figure this out. But no, they're great. Highly recommend. Spend some time with it. All right. Whew. Whirlwind. We are finally at Insider Risk Management, and I think we did a much deeper dive on this than I'm going to have time to get into here some time ago. Insider risk management is going to be taking everything that we have done now and being able to layer in detections of non-standard actions. So we have users that perform fairly standard actions as part of their day-to-day work life, right? They download some files, they tweak some documents, they print a few things, they share some stuff with some colleagues. When they start doing things that are anomalous to their standard behavior, or when they've submitted a resignation letter, or when they've start, I don't know, downloading, or I already said anomalous, when they start doing things that are outside of their usual stuff, or like I said, they've submitted a resignation letter, we want to step up our detections a little bit and say, this doesn't really align with who you are and what you do for the organization. And that can include things like suddenly, instead of pulling data down from the IT share, now they're pulling data in large volumes from the finance share. Now, instead of saving content or tweaking or adjusting files in one area, they're doing file adjustments across everything that they have access to. That may be a ransomware event, right? But we are looking at now ways to detect compromise in accounts from inside the house, right? The call is coming from inside the house. Well, they got through Defender or whatever the tools are that we're using. Now we need to have additional controls to recognize, detect and eliminate risk once the bad guys are already in, or make sure that our users aren't taking data with them on the way to the next organization. So we need to limit the blast radius of users who are compromised or are on their way out. Man. So again, just like everything else, we're going to have a pretty lengthy recommendations list. And I mentioned at the beginning, and you may have seen that my unified settings management was actually paused on the insider risk screen. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. But this is as much of an entire space as the entire rest of the Purview stack, right? So insider risk management there is so much that we can do here, right? You can see just in this one blade, I've got like 10 things shown here. This list is double this, right? So we have a lot of things that we need to get in, understand what we need to do, how to manage it, build out our alerts, our cases, our policies, our users, our reports, manage our forensics evidence, which you now get 20 free gigabytes of space inside Microsoft. You just have to like claim your free space. But there's a whole lot that is here. So going back to that settings, again, we as solutions administrators will manage the settings of these tools so that the solutions operators can get in and do the work that they need to do, right? And the first part that we're going to need to make sure that we light up for those folks is our policy indicators. There are some policy indicators that are on by default, and if you're a compliance person and you don't know, or you're not familiar with this language, our indicators coming from the Defender XDR side are the things that we want to trigger events based on, right? They are user went to a malicious website. They are user executed a file in system context. They are things that are not normal. They're indicators of compromise. In this case, we're just calling them policy indicators, but we have a ton. I mean, this is a fractional list of what's in here, but you do actually need to go in and turn many of these things on. Many of these checkboxes are not on by default. So if you want to start scoring actions and triggering policies and events and creating cases, you do need to actually come in and turn these policy indicators on. So let's look at the workload itself. So in policies, again, just like we saw with the previous one, we have the ability to do 1 and 2 click policies, right? We can create policies really quickly. We also have a list of the policies that have been created in the past. Now you'll notice that all of mine showed that they have warnings. This is a very small demo environment. There's not a lot of activities going on. And those warnings are principally coming up and saying, there's really no actions detected here. This is not a warning saying that tons of users are exfiltrating data. They're saying, my rules are actually not properly defined because they're not catching anything. So it is actually kind of convenient. We can get in here and see very high level what's working, what's not, and why. So we create our quick policies, and we have a list of the available different types of quick policies that we can create. We click on any one of these, and it's going to take us right through, just like we saw earlier, right, with other policies too. We can create a simple policy. We give it a name. It tells us what it's going to do for us. If we like that, we can hit create policy. If we decide this is not complete for our organization and our needs, we can click customize, and then we are going to get a lot of settings and controls and options. And this, I wanted to pause on this because this is one of the first times a lot of people will see the ability to add in things like HR connectors, HR data connectors. And we've spent time talking in the past about Microsoft's investments in minimizing the steps required to provision users into Intra. And for years, they've had support for SuccessFactors and Workday as sources of authority for identity, right? And those HR systems can pass information to Intra, not just about the user name and phone number and department and all that stuff, but they can actually include onboarding and offboarding dates. And we talked about this in the Intra ID governance lifecycle workflows component, where you can use that onboarding date to trigger account creation, license assignment. You can do welcome emails on the user's first day, but you can also use their offboarding dates. So when somebody submits a resume or a resignation letter, it says, I'm out of here next Friday, you can actually have HR data detecting that that user is on their way out the door. And now not only do we need to watch the things that are happening on their last 2 weeks, but we also need to go back over their previous 60 days worth of activity to see, oh, were they just slowly exfiltrating corporate secrets? But we can also then add on physical badging connectors. Do you need to see that the data exfiltration happened while the person was physically in the building? Because remember, we showed that with USB sticks, we can set that they can download data potentially if they're inside the corporate network. So now we actually have the ability with our detections to say they were physically inside the building because they badged in. They downloaded the file to their USB stick because we allowed that from inside the building. Then they physically badged out. Then they submitted their resignation letter. We can get all of that information and build all of that forensic evidence to establish our case to make sure that we understand this is a real scenario where a real user really exfiltrated data. Obviously, this is just a tiny subset of the controls that are available inside of any one of these policies. Insider risk management, like I said, is enormous. There is so much that can be created in here. It is also what pulls on the adaptive protections where you can build conditional access policies in Intra. There are also elements that can allow us some over control. Right. So this is definitely, as I sort of started off with saying, with sensitivity labels, with retention, you want to start simple and add complexity as needed. Insider risk management is definitely in that same vein. You want to start simple, add complexity as needed. All right. Whew. That brings us to the end. There is so much more in insider risk management. I cannot possibly do it justice in the 3 minutes that I have remaining. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I apologize that it's taken us almost 3 years to revisit Purview. But if you have any questions, if you saw something, you have questions about it, you want to learn more, please reach out. We are always happy to help. And with that, again, thank you so much for joining and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye.